Kia ora. Last week we noted that we will be focusing on propositional knowledge, especially in this course and in this topic, rather than acquaintance knowledge or ability knowledge. And we noted that in order to understand the concept of propositional knowledge better, we need to do conceptual analysis, where what is involved in conceptual analysis is giving a definition of the concept in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. That is, in terms of if and only if. Remember that a necessary condition for something to fall under a concept is something needed for it to fall under the concept. Thus, a necessary condition for something to count as a working car is that it has an engine. So we say that something is a working car only if it has an engine. By contrast, a sufficient condition for something to fall under a concept is something that would guarantee it to fall under that concept. So a sufficient condition for something to count as a working car is that thing is a working Ferrari F8 Spider or a working Holden Cruise. We say that that object over there is a working car if it is really a working Ferrari F8 Spider. Now remember that conceptual analysis is a three-step process. First, you give an initial definition of a concept. Second, you try to find counterexamples. Third, you either reject the counterexample as not possible or compelling after all, or you accept the counterexample either by refining your initial definition of the concept so as to avoid the counterexample, or by coming up with a whole new definition of the concept to avoid the counterexample. And then you repeat the process however many times you need to be satisfied with your definition. This is what we're about to do with propositional knowledge. So what then might be a good initial definition of propositional knowledge? Well, to come up with a simple definition, think first of what you think is common to all claims to knowledge. You might claim to know that you are tall, that you are hungry, that your auntie is friendly, that the protests were unlawful, that God exists, that dogs are better pets than cats, that you existed 3 minutes ago, and so on. What do all of these knowledge claims have in common? Well, one answer would be that you simply claim to know them. That's what they are, they're knowledge claims. So there we are. We have maybe an initial definition of knowledge. And putting it in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions, it would look like this. Someone knows a proposition, like the sky is gray or that they are hungry, if and only if they claim to know it. That is, if they say or assert or believe that the sky is gray or that they are hungry. Now let's ask whether there are any counterexamples to this definition. So this is a definition that says that knowledge is simply identical to a claim to having knowledge. Is this definition true? Remember, when we ask this question, we have to try and find counterexamples to the definition. And remember the last time we looked at two different kinds of counterexamples. There are counterexamples to the necessary conditions of the definition, to the only if claims, and there are counterexamples to the sufficient conditions of the definition, to the if claims or claim. So call the first the necessity test when we ask whether there are any counterexamples to necessity, and call the second the sufficiency test when we ask whether there are any counterexamples to sufficiency. So let's first focus on finding a counterexample to the sufficient condition in this account of knowledge as a claim of knowledge. This would be a counterexample to the proposition that if someone claims to know something, then they really do know it. Well, if we run the sufficiency test, I think that we can clearly see a counterexample. All kinds of people claim to know things that they don't really know. Think of cult members, flat earthers, anti-vaxxers, or Vladimir Putin. Flat earthers surely don't know that the earth is flat just because they claim to know that the earth is flat, right? So knowledge is not guaranteed by a mere claim to know something. What about the necessary condition, the only if part? The part that says you know something only if you claim to know it. Must you claim to know something to really know it? While counterexamples to this proposition are harder to come by, it seems that we can find some counterexamples. Consider, for instance, that you probably have never explicitly claimed to know that Kazakhstan is closer to the North Pole than Wellington. And yet, surely, assuming at least that you have some grasp of geography, you did know that, right? In fact, there are plenty of other examples like this, examples in which you know something that you have never claimed to know, and these seem like pretty compelling examples. So knowledge does not require a claim of knowledge either. So a claim of knowledge is neither sufficient nor necessary for knowledge. Nevertheless, we might say that there may be something right to the idea that a claim of knowledge is somehow necessary for knowledge. Something right to this idea. Perhaps it is that you know something only if you would claim to know it, if you were to consider it on reflection. So it was the case that you knew that Kazakhstan is closer to the North Pole than Wellington, because at that time, before you had even considered or had ever claimed to know that, it was the case, nevertheless, that you would have claimed to know it had someone asked you whether you knew it, right? And so that might be what the relevant condition is. Maybe so, and we're going to return to this idea soon. So the current proposed definition of knowledge begets too many counterexamples. And so step 3 of our analysis should probably be to start again with a whole new definition of knowledge, a new inkling about what knowledge exactly is, what the essence of knowledge is. So what about this proposal? Someone knows a proposition P if and only if they are certain that that proposition P is true. So this would make knowledge the same as certainty. And think about it. When we know something, we are very often sure of it. We're certain of it, psychologically. I am sure, after all, that the square root of 9 is 3, that Kazakhstan is north of Wellington, and that Russia is currently invading Ukraine. These are things I know, or I'd certainly take myself to know, and they're also things that I'm certain of right now. And indeed, this week's reading by A.J. Iyer, philosopher, also provides a nice discussion of the link between certainty and knowledge. He thinks that indeed something like being sure is necessary, at least for knowledge. But now, so we've got a new proposal on the table that knowledge is certainty rather than a claim of knowledge. But can we think of counterexamples to this view that knowledge just is certainty? Well, here too, I think that we can think of a counterexample to sufficiency, like the one we discussed for the original definition of knowledge above as a claim to knowledge. Cult members, flat earthers, and anti-vaxxers are often certain that, for example, their leader is from God, that the earth is flat, that most vaccines are part of a government conspiracy to control us. But do cult members, flat earthers, and anti-vaxxers really know these things? Surely not, right? Surely we wouldn't say that they know these things just because they are psychologically certain of these things, that they themselves are feel so strongly that they feel certain of them. So mere psychological certainty is not enough for knowledge. It's not sufficient for knowledge, right? What we've learned from this point and from the claim to knowledge account then is that we need some condition on knowledge such as that what we claim to know or are certain of really is true, right? We're going to need this condition for something to count as knowledge. In other words, you can't know something that is false. To use an example I used last week, I can't know that I have 2 psychology degrees because I don't have 2 psychology degrees, right? Let alone 1. This is just not a fact that I can know. I can't know a falsehood. No one can know a falsehood. You can only know what is true. For these reasons, Aya, for example, in the primary reading for this week, takes truth to be necessary for knowledge, alongside certainty, or at least being sure. So you might want to add, so you might think that, yeah, certainty is necessary for knowledge, but certainty by itself is not sufficient, because you've got lots of people who are certain in what they believe, and yet what they believe is false, right? But sadly enough, and I think sadly too for Aya, there is a plausible counterexample to necessity, and to the necessity of certainty for knowledge. That is, I think that there is a case in which one, in fact, a wide range of cases in which one knows a proposition, even though one is uncertain about it, right? So that sometimes so that it's consistent to know something is true and yet also be uncertain about whether it is true. So consider this case, the case that we've called nervous schoolboy. On the day before a test, a schoolboy learns the dates of all the English kings off by heart. However, on the day of the test itself, the boy's intimidating teacher makes him so nervous that he loses all confidence that the answers that suggest themselves to him are correct. As it happens, all the answers he gave were correct, but at that time, he was completely uncertain as to whether they were correct or not. So he's uncertain at the time. Nevertheless, surely it is the case that the schoolboy knew the dates of all the English kings. His sort of occasional uncertainty or temporary uncertainty surely did not preclude him from knowing the dates, and knowing them, we might say, sort of deep down, you know. Similarly, we might also say that I might still know something deep and hard to admit about myself, some suppressed memory or perception of myself, even though I find myself uncertain about it, right? So it seems that uncertainty does not preclude knowledge, that you could know something and not be certain of it. Certainty then is too strong a condition for knowledge. In other words, certainty is not necessary. What then is weaker than certainty? Maybe something like certainty, though, is required for knowledge. And indeed, philosophers have proposed that the right concept here is simply belief, that belief is what is necessary for knowledge. Notice that this explains why certainty often accompanies knowledge, and why claims to knowledge also often come along with actual cases of knowledge. So consider first the relation to certainty. Certainty is belief with full confidence, we might think. So if you're certain that something is the case, you believe it and you're fully confident about it as well. Or certainty might be characterized as belief without any doubts whatsoever. But notice that belief is consistent with some doubt or some lack of confidence. I could believe that God exists even while having some doubts. The nervous schoolboy believes, but is not fully confident of the dates of all the English kings, in the case that we considered, surely. Similarly, a claim to knowledge just is a belief that one has knowledge. So a claim to knowledge is also related to belief. So these are some reasons to think that, judging from the previous accounts that we've looked at, maybe belief is what is required for knowledge. So to combine the necessary conditions that we have learnt so far, first, that a proposition is known only if it is actually true, right? And second, that a proposition is known only if it is believed, what we get is the following account of knowledge with two conditions. Someone knows a proposition, P, if and only if P is true, and they believe that P. In other words, Luke knows that Darth Vader is his father, if and only if Vader really is his father, and Luke believes that Vader is his father. Or you could simply put it as, Luke has a true belief that Vader is his father. This account therefore makes knowledge the same as true belief. Notice that the truth condition here is a metaphysical condition, right? It is a condition about what really exists, about what is real. So here we can see how sort of epistemology relates to metaphysics. So for you to have knowledge, there must be an actual fact that is true, that is known, that is believed, right? So now we have a new and slightly, I think, more promising account of knowledge, namely as true belief. So far, we have specified two conditions for knowledge: belief in a proposition, which is in fact true. But now, of course, we must ask whether this account is met with any counterexamples. Here's a claim. Counterexamples to necessity are practically impossible to find to this account. As a matter of fact, I agree with virtually all philosophers that there are no counterexamples to necessity against this account. What we have to try and do to try and figure out whether there are any is ask this question. Can you think of any cases in which someone knows a proposition, even though it is not true and it is not believed? Give it a go, but I doubt you'll find any. Okay, but what if we run a sufficiency test on the true belief account of knowledge? That is, what if we ask whether there are any cases in which someone believes a proposition where that proposition really is true, and yet where that person does not know the proposition? So a case in which true belief does not equal knowledge, does not equate to knowledge. As a matter of fact, there do seem to be clear cases of this. Imagine, let's go with the schoolboy example from earlier. Imagine, for example, that the schoolboy arrived at true beliefs about the dates of all the English kings by accident, or as a matter of sheer luck. What if he simply guessed the dates every time and happened to get the right answer every time? Or what if he read about the dates of all the English kings from an unreliable source, an unreliable website that in fact typically gets the dates wrong for historical events and persons, but in this case, just got them right? Would we still say that he knows all the dates of the English kings? Most philosophers think not. That is, they argue that mere true belief is not sufficient for knowledge. Just happening to have a true belief that something is the case does not make it that you know that it is the case. Consider also the case of betting, who will run a race, a horse race, and this is a case that you can find in the reading for this week. Betting on a race might result in a true belief that this or that horse will win. But if they really do win, did you really know that they would win prior to them winning? Surely not. Something more then is needed for knowledge, more than just true belief. But what could that be? This is a very tricky question. Consider first that what is lacking in cases of guessing the truth, finding out the truth from an unreliable source, or making bets on what will happen that turn out to be true, it seems that what is lacking is something like the claim that the subject's resulting belief is rational or reasonable. In other words, what we're saying is that it's irrational or unreasonable for the schoolboy to believe the dates of all the English kings simply by guessing them or reading them from an unreliable source, even though his beliefs are actually correct. So he happens to guess all of the dates of when the English kings were born and died. That doesn't seem to make his true belief reasonable or rational. In fact, it seems that he's unreasonable or irrational to believe those dates simply on the basis of guessing what they are and actually turning out to get them right, or reading them from an unreliable source. In other words, we might think that for you to have a rational or a reasonable belief, you have to have, it must have come from a reliable source or something like that. Similarly, A.J. Ayer, in the primary source reading for this week, would say that the schoolboy is not entitled to be sure of the dates of all the English kings. He does not have a right, so to speak, a kind of intellectual right to believe these truths, given that it is a matter of luck that they happen to be true. Nowadays, the way that this point is generally put, and as you can see from the other reading from this week by Edmund Gettier, is that the schoolboy is not justified in his beliefs in the dates of all the English kings. Similarly, I am not justified believing that my horse will win the race just because I betted that she will, even if it turns out that she will win in the end. Just betting that she will, and therefore the resulting belief, even if it turns out to be true, doesn't make it the case that I am now justified believing that my horse will win the race. And it's this extra element that we need for knowledge is the claim here. By contrast, we might think that if the schoolboy read the dates from a reliable school textbook, or if I betted that my horse will win because it has won the last 15 races under similar conditions and against similar opponents, then the schoolboy and I would be justified in our beliefs. And indeed, if they were then true, it would now seem plausible to say that we have knowledge. Indeed, with this third condition of knowledge as justified belief, the resulting analysis of knowledge is called the traditional or tripartite account of knowledge, or simply the justified true belief account of knowledge. It goes like this. Someone knows a proposition P if and only if 1, P is true, 2, she believes that P, and 3, she is justified in her belief that P, or alternatively, her belief is that P is justified. Another way to put this might be this. In this theory, in order for you to know something, it has to be true. You have to think that it's true, and you have to have good reasons for thinking that it's true. If all those conditions are met, then you know something. So then, this account looks pretty good. In fact, it looks so good that something like it was accepted for some time by philosophers in the 20th century. A.J. Ayer himself, in the reading we have given you, arrives at this account. Although, as I pointed out, he thinks being sure that P is necessary for knowledge rather than just believing that P. But should we accept this account? Are there any counterexamples to it? In one of the most famous philosophical papers ever written, a paper that is also ridiculously short, at only 2 pages long, Edmund Gettier raises an important and much discussed counterexample to this analysis of knowledge. To that, we turn in the next chapter.